Naomi did not hear the alarm. She felt it, a low vibration against her wrist, pulling her out of the dark before the sun had any business being awake. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her studio apartment, listening to the building breathe. A pipe knocked somewhere on the floor above. A car moved slowly down the wet street outside. The radiator in the corner clicked twice and went quiet. She counted to 5. Then she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and sat up. The floor was cold. She had forgotten to put the rug back after washing it, and the bare wood pulled the warmth right out of the bottoms of her feet. She stood anyway. Standing was the first commitment of the morning. Everything else followed from that. Her name was Naomi Adeyemi, 26 years old, dark brown skin, natural hair she kept wrapped at night, and a habit of waking before dawn that most people in her life found either admirable or worrying, depending on who you asked. She did not think of it as either. She thought of it as the only hour in the day that belonged entirely to her, before the city woke up and started wanting things. She pulled on her clothes in the dark, a thin long-sleeved shirt, running leggings, a zip-up jacket the color of moss, trainers she had owned for 2 years and refused to replace because they had molded to the exact shape of her feet. She tied her laces by feel, drank half a glass of water standing at the kitchen sink, and picked up her phone from the counter. The walk to the river took 11 minutes. She knew this because she had counted. Not obsessively, or maybe obsessively, but the productive kind. The kind that comes from needing to know how many steps stand between you and the thing you need. 11 minutes from her door, through the gate at the bottom of Merchant Street, along the path between the old gasworks and the community garden, and then down the slope where the ground softened and the air changed and the sound of the city fell away behind a wall of old willows. The river was not dramatic. It did not rush or roar. It moved the way rivers move when they are old and have settled into their course, with a patient, unhurried authority, as though it had already seen everything, and found it mostly interesting. Naomi had found the trail by accident 3 years earlier, when she had first moved to the city for a warehouse job she had taken, because it was the first offer she received, and she needed money more than she needed meaning. She had been walking without a destination, the way you do when a new place still feels like a stage set and you need to find the edges of it, and she had followed the sound of the water without thinking about it. She had stood on the wooden dock at the end of the path and looked at the river in the late evening light and felt, for the first time since packing her things into a second-hand car and driving away from everything she had known, something that was not exactly peace but was close to it. She had come back the next morning, and the morning after that. 3 years later she had missed the trail on perhaps a dozen occasions, when she was sick, when there was ice, once when a storm closed the path. She remembered each absence the way you remember skipping meals, not with guilt but with a specific, physical awareness of something missing. She worked at Clearfield Floral Distribution. The building was a large, low warehouse on the edge of the industrial quarter, smelling always of cut stems and cold water, and the particular clean bitterness of flowers that had been refrigerated overnight. She started at 7 in the morning and finished at 3 in the afternoon. The work was not complicated. Boxes arrived, boxes were sorted, boxes went out on vans to florists, hotels, event venues, restaurants. She worked in receiving, which meant she was the first person to touch most things that came through the building, and she had developed, without intending to, an ability to assess a shipment's quality in about 10 seconds. She could tell just by looking whether the stems had been cut properly, whether the cold chain had been maintained, whether someone had stacked the boxes wrong in the truck and crushed the lower layers. Her supervisor, Colin, wore the same fleece every day and communicated primarily through size. He had told her once, in passing, that she was the most efficient worker he had managed in 12 years. He had looked embarrassed about it immediately and gone back to his clipboard. She had said thank you and meant it. She liked the work because it asked exactly as much of her as she was willing to give. No more. There was honesty in that. You showed up, you did the work, you left. The warehouse did not ask her about her weekend or her plans or whether she was seeing anyone. It simply needed her hands and her attention, and those she could give freely. Her co-workers were a small and varied group. There was Precious, who worked the next station over and talked the way some people breathe, constantly, without apparent effort, in a way that was somehow not exhausting, because she was genuinely interested in everything she was talking about. Precious was 24, originally from Lagos, possessed of an enormous laugh and a remarkable ability to assess a person's character within approximately 45 seconds of meeting them. She had decided, within her first week at Clearfield, that Naomi was worth knowing. She had pursued this determination with cheerful and patient persistence for nearly 2 years, and had been rewarded eventually with what Naomi considered friendship, and Precious considered the greatest personal victory of her professional life. Then there was Owen, who was 50 and quiet and kind and spent his lunch breaks doing crossword puzzles, and Fatima, who was studying part-time for a nursing qualification, and talked about body chemistry, with the casual enthusiasm of someone who has recently discovered that everything is more interesting than it appears. And a rotating cast of temporary workers who came and went with the seasons and whose names Naomi learned and then respectfully released when they moved on. None of them knew much about her life outside the warehouse. This was not because she was unfriendly. She was perfectly friendly. She asked about their children, their courses, their weekends, their opinions on things. She brought biscuits on Fridays sometimes. She covered shifts when people were sick. But there was a line, not visible to others, that she did not cross, and no one had ever quite managed to reach it. She kept the interesting parts of herself tucked in, the way you tuck a letter back into its envelope after reading it. Not hidden exactly, but private, held close, safe. She had reasons for this, good ones. But she did not think about them on mornings like this one, with the city still dark and the air still cool and the path ahead of her empty and known and hers. She reached the gate at the bottom of Merchant Street and pushed through it into the narrow passage between the gasworks wall and the garden fence. The gasworks had been decommissioned for years. The building still stood, vast and rusting, its round metal roof catching the orange glow of the city lights. She had always found it oddly beautiful, this enormous, useless thing. It had been built to do a job and had done it for decades, and now it simply stood there, taking up its space, not apologizing for existing. She thought about that sometimes. The path curved left and the ground started to soften under her feet, the packed dirt giving way to something looser and damper. The willows appeared ahead, their long branches hanging over the path like curtains, and she pushed through them and came out on the other side into the open space of the riverbank, and there was the water, and there was the dock, and there was the morning, gray and still, and entirely hers. She walked to the end of the dock and sat down. The wood was slightly wet with dew. It soaked through the back of her leggings almost immediately, which she found pleasant in a small, strange way. The cold and the damp as a reminder that she was here, present, awake. She put her phone in her jacket pocket and put her earphones in, and opened a podcast about the history of cartography. She found the subject soothing in the same way she found the warehouse work soothing. It was about the human need to understand where things were, to name the borders and the distances, to make a map of the world and say, this is where I am, and this is what surrounds me. She listened, and the river moved, and the light began to change very slowly in the east, going from dark gray to pale gray, to the color of old pearl. A heron landed somewhere downstream, its wing beats slow and enormous in the quiet. A duck moved through the shallows along the opposite bank, leaving a small, tidy wake behind it. Everything was as it always was. She did not yet know that the water below the dock was not as empty as it looked. She did not know that for the past 6 weeks, a man had been entering this river before dawn, not at her dock, but 50 meters upstream, where a shallow shelf of bank allowed him to wade in without being visible from the path. She did not know that he left before she arrived, every morning, without fail, because he had built this practice around the certainty of solitude. She did not know that his name was Ray Alose, that he was 34 years old, that he ran a company with several hundred employees, or that the company was currently facing the kind of quiet internal difficulty that could not be discussed with anyone on his board or his team or in his personal life, because he had spent the last decade carefully maintaining the impression that he was the kind of man who handled everything. She did not know any of this because there was no reason she should. All she knew, on that particular morning, was that the podcast was good, the river was moving, and the sky was doing something beautiful in the east. A line of color appearing at the horizon, not quite gold, not quite pink, something unnamed in between. The kind of color that does not last long enough to be photographed and belongs entirely to the person who happens to be looking at it at the right moment. She was looking at it. For a few minutes, everything else stopped. She had learned, over 3 years of mornings on this dock, that this was the thing the river gave her. Not peace, exactly. Not silence. The river was never silent. The city was never silent. But a kind of temporary clarity, a stillness in the internal noise, a moment in which she was simply a person sitting above water watching light arrive. No history in it, no weight, just the present tense, moving like the current beneath the dock. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them and watched the color deepen and spread across the water's surface. In the warehouse, she was the girl who always arrived early and left on time and never caused problems. In her apartment, she was the woman who kept the kitchen clean and the shelf of books alphabetized and the rug washed on the first Sunday of every month. On the trail, she was simply a person walking. On the dock, she was something she did not have a word for yet, something quieter and more honest than any of the others. The podcast ended. She took the earphones out and sat in the actual silence for a while, Across the river, a light came on in one of the upper windows of the old mill building that had been converted into flats, a yellow square in the gray. Someone else was awake, beginning their day. She watched it for a moment, then looked back at the water. In 40 minutes, she would need to start back toward the gate. In 50, she would need to be dressed for work. In an hour and 15, she would be at her station, pulling the first box of the day off the truck, already falling into the rhythm of the work. But for now, for a little longer, she stayed. She put her chin on her knees and breathed. The dock shifted almost imperceptibly under her, the kind of tiny movement that wooden structures make, settling, adjusting, the way old things do. She noticed it, and then did not. She was watching a piece of bark drift past below her, carried slowly southward in the current. It moved in a long, unhurried arc, turning once as it caught a small eddy near the dock's support post, then continuing on its way. She tracked it until it disappeared around the gentle bend downstream. Then she stood, brushed the back of her leggings with her hand, and put her earphones back in. She selected the next episode. She turned and walked back along the dock toward the bank, through the willow curtain, up the slope. Behind her, in the river, something moved. Not a fish, not the current. A slow, deliberate movement beneath the surface, barely visible in the low light. A shape that rose, stopped, and then settled again. Still, patient, as quiet as the water itself. She did not look back. She never did in those days. She was walking home with the river behind her, and the day ahead of her, and the sky turning properly gold now above the rooftops of Merchant Street, and she was thinking about cartography, and about the box of Kenyan roses she expected to find on the morning truck, and about whether she needed to buy more oats on the way home. She was content, in the particular and modest way she had trained herself to be content, not with everything, but with enough. She did not know yet that enough was about to become a much more complicated word. She pushed through the gate and the city closed around her again, and the river went on moving without her. And in the pale morning light on the surface of the water, there was no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. Except, if you had looked very carefully, if you had been there and paying attention, you might have noticed a ring of small ripples spreading outward from a point in the water not far from the dock, spreading slowly, quietly, in perfect circles, until they reached the bank and disappeared into the reeds. She did not see them, but they were there. The city that surrounded her was ordinary in every direction. Brick buildings and wet tarmac and the smell of a bakery already working 2 streets over. The first buses beginning their routes. A fox crossing Merchant Street at the far end with the unhurried confidence of an animal that owns the early hours. She walked through all of it and felt it settle around her the way it always settled. Familiar and sufficient. A world she had built at a careful distance from the one she had left. She had made a good life here. This was not something she said to herself with satisfaction, because satisfaction required a kind of settling she had not yet fully permitted herself. But she acknowledged it as a fact, the way you acknowledge facts that are true but not yet finished, provisionally, with the understanding that the story was still moving, still going somewhere, though she could not have said in which direction. The oats. She made a note of the oats. She turned into the corner shop at the end of Briar Lane, which was open already. The man behind the counter, whose name she had never learned but whose face she knew as well as she knew anything in this city, nodded at her as she came in. She picked up oats, a lemon, a small packet of almonds. She paid and said thank you and went out. 11 minutes home. She knew this too. She climbed the stairs of her building, 3 flights, the second-floor light still broken, the third-floor neighbor's radio already going through the wall, playing something classical and undemanding. She unlocked her door and went inside and set the shopping on the counter and began to make herself ready for the day. She thought, briefly and without drama, about the ring of ripples on the river. Then she thought about the Kenyan roses, and the day began. Rael Osei did not need an alarm to wake him, and on the mornings he came to the river he did not set one. He simply woke, at 4:45 or 4:50 or thereabouts, his body having learned, over 6 weeks, to come alert at the hour the practice required. He lay still for a moment after waking, the dark of the flat around him, the city outside making its night sounds, and then he rose. He dressed without turning on the lights. He had lived in this flat long enough that darkness was not an obstacle. The flat itself was simple, high-ceilinged, as he had told the estate agent, and also deliberately spare. He owned what he needed. He owned very little that he did not need. The bookshelves held business and history, and 3 novels he had read multiple times. The kitchen held the tools of someone who cooked competently but without performance. The walls held nothing. He had not been ready to put things on the walls yet, which he understood was information about something but had not looked at too closely. He drank water from the kitchen tap. He picked up his canvas bag from beside the door. spare clothes, a towel, a hat he sometimes wore on the walk there and never on the walk back. He left. The building occupied the corner of what had once been a textile manufacturing area and was now, in the way of such areas, a mixture of renovated warehouses and units that had not yet decided what they were. His downstairs neighbor was a ceramics studio that worked only on weekends. The building next door was a recording facility of some kind. He occasionally heard music through the wall, always late at night, always stopping at midnight exactly, as if timed. He found both of these facts entirely agreeable. He liked the idea of people making things in the dark. He walked through the streets in the cold. He did not use his phone on the way to the river. This had been the first rule he had made for the practice, before any of the others. The phone stayed in the bag until he was back home. He had noticed, about 18 months earlier, that the first thing he used to do upon waking was check messages, and the first thing he felt upon checking them was a low, preemptive dread, a bracing against whatever was coming. And he had decided this was not a good way to begin anything. So he had stopped. He let the morning be empty. He arrived at the river without the weight of other people's needs already on his back. The industrial quarter was quiet at this hour. The traffic that would clog the ring road in 2 hours was not yet there. A delivery truck sat parked outside the closed loading bay of a furniture warehouse, engine idling. A pigeon moved along the gutter with the intent purpose of pigeons everywhere, investigating without hope or disappointment. The sky was the particular deep blue of the time before any color arrives, and the streets were still damp from rain that had fallen around midnight. He had found the river 14 months ago. He had moved to this city for reasons that were professionally sound and personally necessary, and he had done the things new arrivals do, walked without a destination, following the city's edges to understand its shape. He had heard the water before he saw it, coming down a slope through a gap in a building line, and he had followed the sound to the bank. He had stood there in the early evening and felt the city fall away behind him, and he had filed this place under things that required further investigation. He had come back 2 days later, at dawn, with the intention of running the trail. He had reached the place where the bank shelved into the shallows and had stood at the edge of the water looking at it. He had not planned what happened next. He had simply waded in. The cold had been enormous, total and uncompromising and brilliant. He had gone into his chest. He had stood there, breathing. The river moved around him, indifferent and ancient, and all the things that had been in his head, the contract difficulty, the board pressure, the particular tiredness of being the only person in the room who fully understood the situation, all of it went quiet, replaced by the single overwhelming fact of the temperature. For 4 minutes he was nothing but a body in cold water, and the relief of that simplicity was something he had not been prepared for. He had gone back the next morning. It was now, by his careful count, the 42nd morning. The trail entrance near the old mill building was quiet. He went through the gate and walked south along the bank, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, his feet finding the path by habit and familiarity. The willows ahead were just visible as shapes in the dark, the river beyond them a low, steady sound. He reached his entry point and stopped. This ritual stopping, the pause before the water, was one of the things he valued most about the practice. It was not meditation exactly. It was simply the pause, the moment between the land and the water, between the world and the river, between the person who arrived carrying everything and the person who went in carrying only the cold. He set his bag on the willow root. He removed his jacket, his shirt. He folded them. He removed his shoes and his socks. He stood in the dark at the edge of the water and looked at the river for a moment. Then he went in. The cold received him the way it always did, completely, without accommodation. His feet found the river bottom, soft and uneven, and he moved forward steadily, the water rising, his body responding with the particular combination of breath and focus that he had learned over 42 mornings. He had stopped gasping at the cold weeks ago. Now he met it as you meet a familiar difficulty, with respect and preparation, and the knowledge of what came next, which was the settling, the moment after the initial shock when the body accepted the temperature and became part of it. He moved downstream, slowly, not swimming hard, drifting essentially, with the current taking most of the work. He had mapped this stretch of river by feel over 6 weeks of mornings. He knew where the bottom dropped away, where the roots of old trees complicated the far bank, where the current ran faster through the narrowing between 2 old stone supports. He knew the river with a particular intimacy, the intimacy of early hours in cold water, and a consistency that most people would call excessive. He floated on his back. The sky was beginning its first change, the deep blue going a shade paler in the east. A single cloud moved overhead, low and slow. He watched it. He watched it without trying to hold it, which was the thing the river had taught him, how to let things move without needing to keep them. This was not a small thing to have learned. He had spent the better part of a decade in a mode of active maintenance, maintaining the company, maintaining the team's confidence in him, maintaining the relationships and the contracts and the external face of an operation that was doing exactly what it said it was doing and was not, at any point, in any kind of difficulty. He was good at this maintenance. It was a legitimate skill, but it required a constant expenditure of a specific kind of energy, the energy of managing perception, of staying ahead of the narrative, of being, always, the steadiest person in the room. He was very tired of being the steadiest person in the room. In the river, there was no room. There was no narrative to manage. There was only the water and the cold and the sky, none of which cared about his reputation or his contracts or the polished competence he carried like a piece of professional equipment. He turned and began swimming back upstream. His company, Osei and North, had been built over 9 years into something that was genuinely good, not good by the standard of businesses that measured goodness by revenue alone, though the revenue was solid, but good in the way he had always meant it to be, ethical, useful, staffed by people who cared about doing the work properly. He had turned down contracts that would have paid well, but required him to operate in ways he could not respect. He had lost opportunities because of this. He had not regretted any of them. The current difficulty was different. It had not come from a values failure. It had come from a judgment error, from trusting a client whose commitment to honesty turned out to be conditional, whose representations during the contract negotiation had been substantially inaccurate, and who was now, facing scrutiny, using a range of tactics that Rael found both unsurprising and genuinely wearying. The solicitor was confident. The accountant was calm. The documentary evidence existed and was being compiled. Everything was as manageable as it could be, given what it was. But it was there, every day, under everything. He waited out. The air was colder than the water in the way that always briefly shocked him on exit. The river, despite its temperature, felt warmer than the open air once you had been inside it long enough. He moved quickly to his bag, dried off efficiently, dressed with the brisk speed of someone who has learned that lingering in the cold serves no purpose once you have committed to leaving it. He picked up his bag. He looked at the river for a moment. The leaving look, the small acknowledgement he gave it every morning, which he did not think of as ritual, but which was unmistakably one. He started walking north. He had been doing this for 6 weeks without encountering anyone on this stretch of the bank, and he had built his understanding of the morning around the assumption of solitude. He passed the dock on his way north, the long wooden platform extending over the water, slightly worn at the planks, the wood holding the memory of weather and use. He glanced at it as he always glanced at it, the worn patch near the end, the slight darkening that spoke of someone sitting there regularly, in the same position, over a long period. Someone came here. He knew this the way you know things that are not your information but are visible. He had not investigated. He had not adjusted his route to avoid the dock, because his route naturally went north and the dock was slightly south, and there was no conflict. But he had noted the worn patch. He had noted the morning it caught his attention, which was the second or third morning, and had filed it and kept walking. 3 mornings later, he had come out of the water 10 minutes later than usual. He had been lying on his back watching the sky and had lost track of the time, which was both the point and the risk of the practice. He had emerged from the water and was dressing when he heard footsteps on the path above, a steady walking pace coming from the north, a person who knew where they were going. He had stood still, half-buttoned, and listened. The footsteps reached the willow curtain, paused, went through. He heard them on the wood of the dock, a small sound as someone sat down, then quiet, a particular, settled quiet, the quiet of a person arriving at a place they knew. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he finished buttoning his shirt, put on his jacket, picked up his bag, and went north. He did not go past the willows. He went along the bank above them and reached the gate and went through it and walked home. In the days that followed, he adjusted his timing. He was out of the water and well north of the willow curtain before the footsteps arrived. He was precise about it. He had not seen the person, had no information beyond the sound of footsteps and the quality of the subsequent silence, which told him, or told the part of him that had been paying attention to such things his whole life, that this was not a casual visitor. This was a person who came with intention. He recognized intention. He recognized, also, the desire not to be interrupted. He had built his entire morning practice around that same desire. So he went north. He kept his time. He did not linger. Except that on the 7th morning after he first heard the footsteps, he paused at the willow curtain on his way north and stood with one hand on a trailing branch for a moment, listening. From the other side came the faint sound of a podcast, something historical, something being discussed with care and precision, the voice calm and measured. He could not make out the words. just the tone. And beneath it, the river. He stood there for less than a minute. Then he went on. He thought about this, walking home. He thought about the quality of choosing to listen to something careful and precise at 5:30 in the morning above a river. He thought about the worn patch in the dock planks, and the specific morning he had thought, this is not a casual visitor, and the quality of the settled quiet. He thought about the fact that this person had been coming to the dock every morning for what the condition of the wood suggested was a very long time. Months, at least. Possibly years. He had arrived here, to this river, 14 months ago. Whoever used the dock had been here before him. The river belonged to them first. He considered this for several mornings without doing anything about it, which was his preferred way of handling information he had not yet fully understood. Hold it, carry it, let it settle, see what it told him over time. What it told him, over time, was that he had developed a kind of neighborliness with a person he had never met. Through the shared and overlapping use of a body of water they both needed in similar ways, for reasons he suspected were not entirely dissimilar. This was, in its own way, one of the more interesting social facts he had encountered in a long time. He was generally good at people. This was not a vanity. It was an operational fact, the result of years spent working with organizations whose difficulties were almost always, at root, people difficulties. He had learned to read the gap between what people said and what they meant, to identify the anxieties underneath the stated positions, to find the specific and human reason why a system that should work on paper was failing in practice. He did this well, not because he was unusually intelligent, but because he was genuinely interested in what made people behave the way they did. The person on the dock interested him. He did not examine this interest very closely. He let it sit where it sat and went on with his mornings and his days, and the ongoing work of holding the company together through its current difficulty. And the river went on being the river, and everything was exactly as it was. Until the morning he stayed too long. He had been in the water, floating on his back, watching a spectacular piece of sky, a rare thing in November, a break in the cloud cover that opened for perhaps 10 minutes to show a field of stars that had no business being so clear in a city of this size. He had watched them. He had watched them for longer than he meant to, and by the time he became aware of the time and turned to swim back upstream, he was already further south than his usual position, the current having carried him while he was looking up. He came out of the water at the dock's edge rather than at his usual bank. He stood in the shallows, knee-deep, and reached for the dock support post, and in the same moment he reached for it, a voice from above said, "There's someone in the water." He looked up. She was standing at the end of the dock, looking down at him. He had a specific and clear impression in the first second. Brown skin, natural hair, large dark eyes, an expression that was in the process of going from startled to very much something else. He registered these things as you register things when you are knee-deep in a cold river at 5:30 in the morning and have just been found. "I can explain," he said. She screamed. She screamed before she knew she was going to. There was no decision in it, no process, no sequence of cause and effect. Just a pair of hands grabbing the dock railing and a sound leaving her chest that she would not have described as hers if someone had played it back to her. It went across the water and through the willows and down the river and, she would later be told by Precious, who had heard it described in stages of increasing elaboration, was apparently loud enough to remove a heron from its position 30 yards downstream with some force. Then she was backing up the dock on her hands and heels, which was both physically undignified and completely involuntary, and she hit the post at the far end with her shoulder, and gripped it with both hands and looked at the thing in the river, which was not a thing. It was a person. He was standing in the shallows beside the dock, shoulders above the surface, looking up at her with an expression she would have needed several words to describe accurately, and which she did not have the mental capacity to reach for, because she was currently running on approximately 40% of her usual cognitive function, due to the recent scream. "I can explain," he said. His voice was so calm she thought for a moment that she had imagined the rest. "You're in the river," she said. "Yes." "You're in the river, at 5:30 in the morning." "Yes." "And you were—" She looked at the water below the dock, below where her feet had been hanging, below where she had been sitting for the past 30 minutes in what she had believed to be absolute solitude. "You were in the river, under the dock, nearby the dock. The current brought me further south than intended. I usually come out further upstream." She stared at him. He met her gaze from the water with a steadiness that was, in the circumstances, almost aggressive. "On purpose," she said. "You're in the river on purpose." "Yes." "In the dark. The light is coming up." She looked at the sky. He was, technically, correct. The first gray was beginning. It did not feel like sufficient justification for what she was looking at, but it was technically correct. "Why?" she said. He appeared to take this as a genuine question rather than an expression of existential bewilderment, which it was partly both. "I do it most mornings," he said, "for the cold and the quiet." She held onto the post and looked at him for a long moment. He was very large. This was apparent even from the limited perspective of him standing in 3 feet of water, large and calm, and making no movement to come out of the river, which she appreciated vaguely because she needed another moment to reassemble her brain. "How long?" she said. "In the river. This river." "About 6 weeks." 6 weeks, she said. The number went into her like something cold. 6 weeks. Every morning. Most mornings. At this time. I'm usually earlier. I was later than usual today. She looked at the water again. She thought about her feet. She looked back at him. "I sit here," she said. She pointed at the worn patch of plank with the precision of someone pointing at evidence. "Right there. Every morning. For 3 years. I know," he said. "I've heard you." There was a silence during which several things happened in her chest simultaneously, none of them organized. "You heard me," she said. "You arrive at roughly 5:45. I'm usually gone before then. This morning I was not. You heard me arriving, and you stayed in the water rather than—" She stopped, looked at the water, looked at him, rather than saying anything. The first time it seemed unnecessary to introduce myself. After that it became a habit. The habit of being in a river under someone's dock without telling them. He appeared to acknowledge this framing. "Yes," he said. "That was, in retrospect, a poor sequence of decisions." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the same composure he had maintained since surfacing, and she noted, with some irritation, that the composure was not false. It was not the composure of someone performing calm. It was the composure of someone who was actually calm, which was in one sense more understandable, given that he was the one with context, and in another sense more infuriating. "Come out of the water," she said. "I'm quite comfortable. You've been in cold water for, how long?" "About 25 minutes. Come out of the water." He moved toward the bank, wading toward his entry point rather than toward the dock, with the good judgment of someone who understood that climbing up onto her dock without invitation would be a further infraction. She walked back along the dock toward the bank and stood at its end, watching him come out. He moved through the water with a complete lack of drama about it. He reached the bank and stepped up onto the flat shelf of ground, and she turned half away while he toweled off and changed, which she did out of basic courtesy and not, she told herself, for any other reason. "What's your name?" she said. "To the river." "Rael," he said, from behind her. "Rael Osei." She turned back. He was dressed, dry clothes pulled on over the wet of the entry, his jacket on, a canvas bag now over his shoulder. Standing on the bank in the growing gray of the early morning, he was very considerably taller than she had registered from the dock. She found herself making a rapid and involuntary visual assessment, the kind her brain performed on any new piece of information without consulting her preferences about it, and concluded, in approximately half a second, that he had the sort of face that required more looking than a single glance would serve. She noted this conclusion and immediately put it in a category labeled, "Things Not Currently Relevant," and moved on. "I'm Naomi," she said. He nodded. "You need to be out of the water before I arrive," she said. "Yes," he said. "Your timing needs to be reliable." "It will be." She looked at him for a moment longer. He met her gaze directly, without the small deflection most people performed when she held eye contact past the usual duration. "Good," she said. She picked up her phone from where she had set it on the dock railing, registered that it was dead, decided this was the appropriate ending to this particular morning, and turned to walk back through the willows. "Naomi," he said. She stopped. "I'm sorry about the scream," he said, not her scream. The scream she had given because of him. The distinction was subtle and correct. She thought about this for a moment. "Don't be in my water," she said, and went through the willows. She walked up the slope and through the gate and onto Merchant Street, and the city was there waiting for her as it always was, going about its ordinary business, indifferent to the fact that she had just spent 6 weeks sitting above a man in a river and had only discovered this because he could not keep track of the time. She walked home. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she made coffee and got ready for work, and the day opened around her, and she carried the morning's events with the same careful containment she applied to everything she did not yet know what to do with. She was extremely good at containment. This was one of the things she was most proud of, and one of the things she was most tired of, and she did not think about the gap between those two observations, because thinking about it would require her to think about a great many other things, and she had a shift to get to, and boxes did not sort themselves. She told Precious at 11 o'clock. She had not planned to. She had walked to work with the morning's events catalogued and contained, and she had spent the first 4 hours of her shift performing the ordinary business of the day. Boxes, manifest, assessment, next box, repeat. And she had been successfully not thinking about it for most of that time. Then Precious asked how her morning was, and Naomi opened her mouth and said, "A man came out of the river next to me." Precious put down her mug. "Say that again," said Precious. Naomi said it again. She told it from the beginning, the surfacing, the scream, the extraordinary calm of a man who had been in cold water for 25 minutes and still managed to sound like someone conducting a perfectly normal conversation, the explanation, the agreement about timing, the name. She told it the way she told things, accurately, without embellishment, leaving out only her internal experience, which was not, she maintained, relevant to the account. Precious listened with her chin in her hand. Her expression moved through several phases. Initial alarm, rapidly followed by something more complicated, then a settling into the kind of concentrated attention she brought to information that she had decided was important. "And you don't know who he is," Precious said, when Naomi finished. "I know his name. Rael Osei." "Yes." Precious looked at her for a moment. Then she reached for her phone with deliberate speed and typed something and scrolled. Naomi watched. Precious looked at the screen for 3 seconds, then turned the phone around. LinkedIn. A professional photograph. Not stiff, not performed. The photograph of someone who knew their face well enough to not arrange it specially. A name. Rael Osei, co-founder and managing director, Osei & North. Below that, a list of credentials and tenure that was not brief. Naomi looked at the photograph. It was him. The face she had been successfully not thinking about for the past 4 hours, registered now in the particular specificity of daylight and screen resolution, the bones of it, the set of the mouth, the quality of the attention visible even in a static professional image that had been taken in a conference room somewhere, with a photographer directing him to look slightly left of the lens. She handed the phone back. "A company director," Precious said. "Managing director," Naomi said. "You corrected his title." "I'm being accurate." "You're being accurate about the professional title of a man you met 8 minutes ago in a river." Naomi picked up her coffee mug. It was lukewarm. She drank it anyway, because having something to do with her hands was useful. "I'm providing context," she said. "You looked at the photo for a while," Precious said. "I was reading his professional information." "His professional information is in the text beneath the photo." Naomi put the mug down. She looked at Precious. Precious looked back at her with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she was saying something true that Naomi did not want to engage with. Patient, affectionate, and completely immovable. "He was unexpectedly calm," Naomi said, after a brief pause during which she assessed her options and found them limited. "When you scream at a person who has just come out of a river next to you, the normal response is some form of flustering. He was not flustered." "Not flustered," Precious said. "No. In what way was he not flustered?" "In the way of..." Naomi searched for the word that was accurate without being the word she was not going to use. "In the way of someone who was in a slightly unusual situation and assessed it and responded to it without needing to perform about it." Precious looked at her for a long moment. "You just described a man being competent," she said, with the energy of someone describing a work of art. "I did not." "You did. A little bit." "Precious." "Naomi, my love," Precious said, in the gentle, precise tone she used when she had decided honesty was the appropriate tool. "You are telling me about the second most interesting thing that has happened to you in 3 years, by your own account. And you are describing it with the same expression you use when you are explaining cold chain documentation to the new staff." Naomi was quiet. "What was he like?" Precious said. "Not like asking for a description, like asking for the truth of it, with the certainty of someone who already knew the truth and wanted to hear it confirmed." Naomi thought about it. She thought about his voice in the water, and his face in the growing light of the morning, and the way he had said the first time it seemed unnecessary, and the way she had heard this as something honest rather than something convenient, and the way he had looked at the worn patch in the dock planks with an expression she had not been close enough to fully read. "He was very direct," she said, "and he listened in a way that was... it was different from most people listening. Most people are waiting. He was actually receiving." Precious said nothing. She was watching Naomi with careful attention. "And he was very calm," Naomi said. in a way that was not about being unaffected. It was about, I think he's the kind of person who has done work on himself that he doesn't advertise. A silence. Go on, Precious said. That's all, Naomi said. That's the observation. That's not all, Precious said. Precious. You said he was very direct, he listened well, he was calm, in a specific and considered way, and you know he has done internal work. That is not the observation of a person who spent 8 minutes with a stranger. Naomi stood up. The break was ending. She could hear Colin's distinctive footstep pattern in the corridor. He needs to keep better track of his timing, she said, picking up her mug to rinse it, so that we're not both on the bank at the same time. That's the practical takeaway. Is that the only takeaway? Precious said. Yes, Naomi said, with complete conviction, and left the break room. She heard the sound behind her that was Precious choosing not to say the next thing, which was a specific and recognizable sound, a kind of restrained and affectionate amusement. She went back to her station and put her gloves on and picked up the next box and checked the manifest and began. She was thinking about flowers, she was thinking about the Kenyan roses and the cold chain, and the proper angle of a cut stem, and the exact temperature at which certain varieties began to deteriorate. She was thinking about all of this with absolute focus. She was also, underneath that focus, thinking about a man who listened in a way that was actually receiving, and the fact that she had noticed this in 8 minutes of riverbank conversation, and the fact that she had noticed that she had noticed it, and the fact that she was not going to do anything about any of it, because she had not finished deciding whether there was anything to do. She worked through the afternoon. At 3 she clocked out. She said goodbye to Precious, who gave her a look of eloquent restraint. She walked home in the thin autumn light, bought oats and a lemon at the corner shop, went upstairs, made dinner, read for an hour. At 8:30 she went to bed. She lay in the dark. She thought about a man in a river who did not flinch when she screamed. Then she went to sleep. She was almost certain she did not dream about it. She would have gone back regardless. The trail was hers. The dock was hers by 3 years of daily presence, which was, she maintained internally, a stronger claim than any legal document. A man emerging from the water was not sufficient reason to abandon something she had built her mornings around. She had given up too many things over the past several years. She was not giving up this one. She arrived the next morning at 5:45, and the dock was empty, and the river was moving, and nothing was different, except that she was aware, for the first time, of the water as something that extended under the dock as well as in front of it, and she sat down on the worn patch of plank, with the knowledge of this new dimension, and did not entirely know what to do with the knowledge. She pressed play on the podcast. She listened. The river moved. Precious asked at work. She said, no, he was not there. Precious said, in a tone of careful neutrality, right, and went back to the next box. On the third morning after the encounter, she arrived to find a coffee cup on the railing. She stopped at the end of the dock and looked at it. A disposable cup, with a lid, standing upright on the flat section of railing closest to the bank. It was warm. She could see the faint curl of steam from the lid in the cold morning air. There was nothing written on it. No note, no name. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down and picked it up and drank it. Black, no sugar, strong and clean. She thought about this for a while. She had never told him how she took her coffee. She had never told him anything about herself beyond her name, and the fact that she had been sitting on this dock for 3 years. Black, no sugar could not be tailored to her. It was simply his own preference, offered without modification, which was either entirely impersonal or somehow its own kind of precision. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and looked at the river, and listened to her podcast, and the coffee was good, and the morning was cold, and somewhere to the north of her, she understood without needing to look, a man was walking home through the industrial streets with his canvas bag on his shoulder, having left something on a railing without a note because notes are impersonal and coffee is practical, which was a thought she did not know she would have until she had it, and which made her press pause on the podcast and sit in the actual silence of the river for a while. She told Precious about the coffee at the first opportunity. Precious was silent for 3 full seconds, which was genuinely unprecedented. He left you coffee, Precious said. He left a coffee, on the railing. Black. Yes. He didn't know how you take it. No. So he left what he'd leave for himself. Or he left black because it's the absence of additions and requires no specific knowledge. Precious looked at her with the expression of someone choosing, charitably, not to say that these were the same thing. How was it? She said. It was very good, Naomi said. Precious said nothing. She was doing the thing where she communicated volumes through the quality of her silence, which she had perfected over 2 years of working next to a person who required more patience than most. It doesn't mean anything specific, Naomi said. Of course not, said Precious. It's a neighborly gesture. We share a space. He was acknowledging that. People who are being purely neighborly, Precious said, leave notes. Naomi put her gloves back on. Notes are impersonal, she said. There was a brief, charged silence. Naomi, Precious said slowly, that's the kind of thing someone who's been thinking about this would say. Naomi picked up a box. She began checking the stems. I'm going back to work now, she said. 3 mornings later there was another coffee. Same cup, same railing, same temperature. She drank it. She did not look upstream on the way out. She walked to the gate and went through and did not slow down. The morning after that she arrived 2 minutes early. He was crossing the bank toward the willow curtain when she came through the gate. He stopped. She stopped. About 15 meters between them, the bank and the cold air. He had his bag on his shoulder. His clothes were dry. He had already been in the water and changed, which meant he had come out early, and then waited, or had come out at his usual time, and was simply on his way north later than usual. She could not tell which. You were early, she said. I was late, he said. A small silence. The coffee, she said. Yes. You don't need to. I know. I didn't not enjoy it. The particular quality of the pause that followed this told her he had noted the double negative and chosen to treat it as the information it was, rather than the deflection she had intended it to be. Good, he said. She looked at the river behind him. The light was coming properly now, the mill on the far bank going from a dark outline to its actual brick-red self in the growing morning. The cartography podcast, he said. She looked back at him. You're on the 3rd series, he said. The ocean mapping one. She was quiet for a moment, processing. You could hear what I was listening to, she said. When you arrived and the earphones weren't quite in, and occasionally if you took them out, the sound carries across the water. She held this information carefully. The idea of him in the water, in the dark, hearing the first seconds of her podcast before she settled on the dock, hearing her arrive, hearing the sound of a person who believed herself to be entirely alone, doing the small, private things of a private morning. She should have found this unsettling. She did not find it entirely unsettling. The 4th episode, she said, of the ocean mapping series. It's the best one. She turned and went through the willows. She sat on the dock. The river moved. She did not press play on the podcast for several minutes, and in the silence she heard, faintly, footsteps going north along the bank. Steady, unhurried, already somewhere else. She listened until she could not hear them anymore. Then she pressed play. 3 days later, when they were both on the bank at the same time again, him coming out of the water, her arriving slightly early, he said, You were right. The 4th episode was the best one. And she said, The stick charts. And he said, The stick charts. And that was all it was, but she carried it home the way you carry small things that are heavier than they appear. And she thought about it more than she intended to. And she went to work. And the day was ordinary. And the days that followed were ordinary. And underneath the ordinary, steadily and without announcement, something was changing. Rael told himself on the walk home that it was not significant. He was a man who applied rationality carefully and often. He understood the mechanisms by which ordinary events acquired unearned weight, through repetition, through isolation, through the way the mind assigns meaning to available material when other material is scarce. He had been operating in near total professional solitude for months. He had been living in a city where he had no long-standing relationships. He had been spending 40 minutes a day in cold water as a form of managed discomfort. In this context, he reasoned, a chance encounter at a dock would naturally feel notable. He understood this mechanism. He had explained similar mechanisms to clients dozens of times in different forms. He was entirely capable of seeing it clearly and naming it accurately. He thought about this for the entire walk home. Then he sat at his counter with his coffee and opened his laptop and began answering emails, and he did not think about it again until his 9 o'clock call with his solicitor, during which he was summarizing a critical point about documentary evidence and found himself, mid-sentence, thinking about a cartography podcast and the sound of earphones not quite in place, and a woman who said I didn't not enjoy it, with the very specific reluctance of someone who has decided to be honest, and is performing the smallest possible version of that honesty. He pulled himself back to the call. His solicitor, Diane, had been his solicitor for 6 years. She was precise and thorough and had a gift for presenting complex legal situations in terms of practical risk without losing any of the accuracy. She told him that the documentation was progressing well, that the other party had made several representations in recent weeks that were demonstrably inaccurate, and that she was reasonably confident they would be in a strong position before the end of the calendar year. She recommended patience and systematic record-keeping. He agreed. He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a moment looking at his laptop screen. His company had 18 staff. He knew all 18 well. Their working styles, their strengths, the things they were developing, the projects they were most proud of. He had built the team gradually and with real care, choosing people who were interested in the work rather than in the status the work provided. He did not regret the size. He could have grown faster, and had chosen not to, because he had seen companies break under rapid growth and had no interest in repeating that mistake. The 18 of them knew there was a contract difficulty. They did not know its scope, because knowing its full scope would have disrupted the team at precisely the moment when stability mattered most. He had given them as much truth as was operationally useful and was carrying the rest himself. This was his job. He did not resent it, but he felt it, every hour, in the particular way you feel things that are true, and heavy, and entirely yours. He opened his emails. Harriet, his finance director, had sent her weekly operational summary, 4 pages, precise and comprehensive, with 3 items flagged for his attention. He read it carefully and added the flagged items to his working list. Harriet's updates were one of the constants of his week that he relied on more than he would have articulated, not just for the numbers, but for the demonstration of competence they represented. He trusted Harriet the way he trusted very few people, which was specifically and on the basis of extended evidence. His phone showed 2 texts from his mother in Accra. She texted when she was slightly worried. She called when she was more worried. 2 texts meant she was monitoring something without being alarmed by it, which was a reasonably accurate description of his current situation from the outside. He texted back, "I'm well. Busy as usual. We'll call Sunday." The full stop after Sunday so it did not look like a dismissal. He made a second coffee and went back to work. At lunchtime he went for a walk through the market area, which he had started doing some months earlier as a way of breaking the day without making it about exercise, which the river already provided. He walked past stalls selling things he did not buy and through streets he knew by their layout and rhythm, and he thought about the company and the solicitor and Harriet's flagged items and the call he needed to have with his operations director this afternoon. He was also thinking, with somewhat less discipline than he would have liked, about the doc. Not the doc specifically, the person who used it. The quality of her intelligence, which had been evident in the speed of her assessment during the encounter. Not just the anger, which was entirely appropriate to the situation, but the way the anger coexisted with genuine inquiry, the way she had processed what he said and evaluated it, rather than simply receiving it. He had told her the truth about the river and she had listened to it the way you listen to something you are deciding whether to believe, which was, he thought, the correct way to listen to anything from a stranger. He had also been thinking about the stick charts. Not the stick charts themselves, though they were genuinely interesting, the navigational charts used by Pacific Islanders, constructed from reeds and shells to represent ocean swells and island positions, readable only by those trained to understand them, encoding in physical form the knowledge that had been developed over generations of reading the movement of water. He had listened to the 4th episode while walking, the morning after she mentioned it, and had sat on a bench in the market area for 20 minutes after the episode ended, thinking about what it meant to develop a language for something you needed to navigate by, and to carry that language in your body, rather than in text. He was thinking about this rather more than the subject matter warranted, and he was aware of this, and he let it sit where it sat. His operations director was a woman named Claire who had been with Osei and North for 6 years, and whose judgment he trusted with an almost absolute confidence. She had been there long enough to know when something was affecting him before he had acknowledged it himself, and she exercised this knowledge with a discretion that he respected enormously, never naming things directly, but creating the conditions under which he could name them himself if he chose to. After their afternoon call, she stayed on the line, in the way she sometimes did, and said, to the general air rather than to him specifically, "You've seemed elsewhere for a few weeks." "I'm entirely present," he said. "Professionally present," she said. "Something else is taking a bit of the background processing. I'm noting it because it's relevant to how you're operating and because I work for you, and that's what I'm supposed to do." He thought about this. "The contract situation," he said. "Partly," she said, "but also something else, something lighter." He said nothing. "It's not a criticism," she said. "Something lighter is usually a good thing." He thanked her and she let it go, which was the thing he had always valued most in her, the ability to say the difficult thing once and then release it entirely. He sat at his desk after the call and thought about what she had said. Something lighter. He turned this over. He thought about the morning's encounters, the small accumulated weight of mornings over 3 weeks. Coffee on a railing, footsteps on wood, a podcast heard through the gap of earphones not quite in place, a voice saying the 4th episode was the best one, with the precision of someone who had genuinely listened and formed a genuine view. He thought about the worn patch in the dock planks, which he had noted on the very first morning, and which now seemed like a kind of emblem for something he had been assembling without quite knowing what he was assembling. He was not, by temperament or experience, someone who moved quickly toward things that interested him. He moved toward them carefully, gathering information, assessing conditions, understanding the situation before committing to a position. He had done this with the company, with most of his significant professional decisions, with the city he had moved to. He did it, when he reflected on it honestly, with most things that mattered to him. He went to the river in the morning. He was out of the water and north of the willows before 5:30. He walked home. He made coffee. He checked his phone. He did not alter the pattern. But he also could not fully account, when he was being entirely honest, for why he had left the coffee on the railing that first morning. He had been at the trail entrance on the 4th day, bag on his shoulder, on his way north, and he had looked at the railing and at the cup in his hand, and had simply set it down. He had not considered it beforehand. He had not made a decision about it. He had just done it. This was, he thought, as he stood at his kitchen counter at the end of a long day eating reheated rice and watching the dark outside the window, unusual for him. He did not typically act without prior consideration in matters that had any social dimension to them. He was deliberate. He prepared. He had left a coffee on a railing in the dark without preparation or deliberation. He thought about what Claire had said, something lighter. He washed his bowl and dried it and put it away. He made a list of the things that needed to happen the next day, in order of urgency. He read for an hour, a book about the development of modern supply chains that was more interesting than it sounded, and that he had been working through for 2 weeks. He set his phone on the counter. He lay in the dark and listened to the city outside. He thought about a person sitting on a dock in the early morning above a river, listening to a podcast about stick charts, wrapping her hands around a coffee cup, watching the sky do something unrepeatable in the east. He thought about the worn patch in the planks and the 3 years it represented, and what it meant to choose a place and come to it every morning for 3 years, not because you had been recommended to, but because the place and the morning between them gave you something that the rest of the day did not. He understood this. He understood it with his whole body. He went to sleep without deciding anything. In the morning, he went to the river. There were things she had not told Precious. Precious knew about the coffee. She knew about the morning encounters on the bank, the brief exchanges, the way the arrangement had settled, him north of the willows before she arrived, the river between them, and sometimes not between them, the small vocabulary they had developed of information shared without requirement. She knew all of this because Naomi had found herself telling her, in segments, the way information comes out when it does not feel like an announcement, but accumulates toward one. What Precious did not know, what no one in this city knew, was about the phone call. It had come at 11 at night, 11 days after the morning in the river. A number she had kept in her phone and never used. The number of her father's brother, Owen. She had not heard Owen's voice in 4 years. She had not heard most of her family's voices in 4 years. This was not an accident. It was not a rupture. It was simply what had happened when she had packed her things at 22 and driven away from a situation that was complicated in the way only family situations are complicated, layered with love and damage in equal measure, accumulated over years, in a configuration that she had needed, finally and at some cost, to remove herself from. She had not answered Owen's call. She had sat on her sofa and watched the phone ring in her hand and felt the room do the thing rooms do in those moments, the stillness, the slight slowing of everything, the strange quality of time when it is carrying something heavy. The call ran out, no voicemail. She had sat for a long time after the screen went dark, holding the phone and thinking about nothing specific, which was the form her thinking often took when something had reached a place that did not have words yet. She had gone to bed. She had not slept well. In the morning she had gone to the river and sat on the dock and felt the familiar weight of a specific past settling around her like weather. She had listened to her podcast. She had watched the water. The river had moved, which was the thing about the river. It always moved. It could not stop moving. Whatever you brought to its banks, it went on. This was not comfort exactly, but it was something. She had thought about calling Owen back for 2 weeks. She had turned the thought over each morning on the dock, approached it from different angles, assessed what she would say and what he might say, and what the weight of it would be to carry in either direction. She had not called. She had not been ready. She was not ready until she was ready, and she had learned, over the years, to respect this in herself even when it looked like avoidance from the outside, because the distinction between avoidance and preparation was, in her experience, more meaningful than most people acknowledged. Then the text came. His text, Naomi. We have some news, family news, nothing bad. I'd like to speak with you when you're ready. No pressure, I'm here. She had read it in the warehouse car park after her shift, sitting in her car in the low afternoon light, and she had felt the text the way you feel, something that was already on its way and has now arrived. She had not called that day. She had gone home and made dinner and sat with her book and read the same paragraph 4 times without it going in. She had gone to bed at 9, which was too early, and lay in the dark and thought about her grandmother, who was 81 and not well, and who had given her a long-held hug 4 years ago at a family gathering that turned out to be the last one. She had not known it would be the last one. You rarely did. In the morning she had gone to the river. She had arrived at 5:45 and the dock had been empty, as usual, and she had sat on the worn patch of plank and pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, which was the position she sat in when she was not okay, which was different from her usual position, and which she was aware of without being able to change it. She heard footsteps on the path. She looked up. He was there. On the bank, 10 meters away, his bag in his hand. He had come from the south rather than the north, which meant he had come from the water and was still on the bank side of the willows, which was unusual. He stopped when he saw her expression. There was a pause. He set his bag down on the bank. He came to the end of the dock and sat down beside her, leaving the careful space he always left. Not intrusive, not so far away as to be formal, the distance of someone who understood both proximity and respect. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at the river. They sat in silence for a while. You don't have to tell me anything, he said. I know, she said. I'm not going to ask. I know that too. The river moved. The light came slowly, November pale and without warmth. The heron was downstream somewhere. My uncle called, she said. It came out simpler than she had prepared for it to, a fact arriving before its packaging. He was quiet. He gave it its space. We haven't spoken in 4 years, she said. That's a long time, he said. Just that. No why, no but, no how. He said it was family news, not bad news. Will you call him back? She thought about this honestly. When I know what I want to say. You don't have to know before you call. I do, she said. For some conversations, the ones that cost something, I need to be ready before I go into them, or I say things I don't mean, or I go silent in ways that read as something they're not. He looked at the river. He breathed slowly. That sounds like a lot of preparation, he said. It is, she said. A pause. Exhausting, he said quietly. It was the last thing she expected him to say. Confirming rather than questioning. Not you could try it differently or some people find it helpful to just call, which was what most people said. Just, that sounds exhausting, said with the quiet certainty of someone who knew what it cost. She felt something catch in her chest, small and specific. A bit, she said. They sat together on the dock with the cold and everything around them and the river going on below them, and she thought about her grandmother and the long hug and the 4 years and the text that was still in her phone, and she thought about the weight of prepared conversations and the price of that preparation, and she looked at the water and breathed. Rael, she said, after a while. He looked at her. Your company, she said, is something wrong with it? He was quiet for a moment. In the sense of ending or failing, no, he said. In the sense of a difficulty that costs time and energy and attention, yes. A contract problem. Yes. Can you talk about it? My solicitor knows the details, he said. My accountant knows the numbers. Beyond that, he paused. Not really. She looked at the water. I told you about my uncle, she said, meaning, I have offered you something, and you can offer me something back, or not, and either is acceptable, but the offer is made. He heard this. She could tell because he was, as she had identified 3 weeks ago, the kind of person who actually listened. A client we took on 18 months ago, he said. They represented their situation in ways that turned out to be substantially inaccurate. Now that there's scrutiny, they are being difficult. The documentation to counter their position exists but is taking time to compile. My solicitor is confident. The outcome is manageable. He paused. But it sits under everything. All the time, it is always there. She nodded. Like being in cold water you did not choose, she said. He looked at her, and for just a moment, a brief and unguarded moment, the composure was not composure but simply a face, a real, tired, somewhat relieved face. Exactly like that, he said. They sat together on the dock in the early cold of November, two people who had told each other the smallest viable version of their heaviest current things, and left everything else where it was, which was not the same as pretending it was not there, and which both of them understood. After a while he stood up. I'm late, he said. Go, she said. He picked up his bag. He looked at her once. That direct, unhurried look. The uncle, he said. I'll call, she said, when I'm ready. He nodded. He went north. She stayed. The river moved. The light came up. She sat on the dock until it was time to go, and then she stood and went back through the willows and up the slope, and the city opened around her, ordinary and waiting, and she walked into it. She called Owen that night. The night she called was a Thursday. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside it, and she looked at the number for 20 minutes, and then she pressed call. Owen answered on the second ring. Naomi. Her name in his voice with everything it held, the relief, the care, the years, the distance. Uncle Owen, she said. They spoke for 45 minutes. She had prepared for 10. She had braced for the kind of careful exchange that requires management and leaves you depleted. The conversation you survive rather than have. Instead, she found something that moved more easily than she had expected, the way water finds its level when you stop blocking it. Owen told her about her grandmother, 81, not well, but home and comfortable. The family wanted her to know. Her grandmother had asked about her. Not as a reproach, Owen was careful to say this, and she believed him, because Owen had always been careful, and she had always believed him. Simply asked about her, simply wanted to know. She asked about her cousin, Owen's daughter, who was finishing her accountancy qualifications. She asked about the house. She asked, because she genuinely wanted to know, about the tomatoes her grandmother grew in the back garden every summer, which had always been remarkable, which had always produced more than any reasonable garden should produce, which had always been given away to neighbors in quantities that constituted a summer project. Very good this summer, Owen said, before the illness, the best in years. She thought about this. Her grandmother's garden, the tomatoes in August, the specific smell of the greenhouse attached to the back of the house, warm and green, and full of something she did not have a word for, the smell of growing things in an enclosed space. She had not thought about that greenhouse in 4 years. They said goodnight. Owen said, before he hung up, you can call whenever you like. She said, I know, and meant it. She sat at the table after the call, in the specific quiet of a conversation recently ended, the air still holding the shape of it. Then she went to bed and slept, for the first time in 2 weeks, without the low restlessness that had been sitting under everything, not resolved, not fixed, but moved, slightly, the way things move when you finally stop holding them exactly still. In the morning she woke before the alarm and lay in the dark and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Smaller than peace, more real than peace. Something like the very first movement of a thing that has been still for too long, just beginning to go. She got up, she dressed, she walked to the river. He was there when she arrived. On the dock, already dressed, his bag beside him, a coffee in each hand. He had come out earlier than usual and stayed, which he had never done before. He was sitting on the dock, on her end of the dock, her worn patch of plank, with his long legs stretched in front of him and his face turned toward the river. He looked up when she came through the willows. He held out one of the coffees. She took it. She sat beside him, closer than the careful distance they usually maintained. Not close, still themselves, but the space between them was different this morning, contracted by something that did not require naming. How did it go? He said. My grandmother is not well, she said. I'm going to see her at Christmas. He looked at the river. Good, he said. It was hard, and it was fine, she said. Both at once. My uncle is, he's kind. He has always been kind. That's a different thing from easy. He nodded. They looked at the river together. A piece of bark moved past below them, turning slowly in the current. She watched it. He watched it. How long has it been difficult? She said. The contract thing. 18 months in total, 9 months since I moved here. And you've carried it alone that entire time? Yes. She held her coffee with both hands. The warmth of the cup was exactly right in the cold. You should have someone, she said. I have Diane and Harriet. Someone who is not on the payroll. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Is it pride? She said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He thought about it. She watched him think about it, which she had learned to appreciate, the visible process of someone taking a question seriously, rather than responding to its surface. Partly, he said, and partly the belief that distributing weight onto people who cannot carry it effectively does not relieve the weight. It just spreads it into places it makes things worse. That's not untrue, she said, but it has a cost. Yes, he said, it does. They sat for a long time after that without speaking. The morning opened around them, the pale November light filling the air above the water, the city beginning its sound somewhere behind the willows. A moorhen called from the reeds on the far bank. The bare trees on the far bank were black against the brightening sky. She thought about what it meant to be alone with something heavy for a long time. She thought about the quality of the river, its total indifference to the weight you carried to its banks. It did not help in any active way. It did not listen or respond. It simply moved. And somehow the moving was the help, the ongoing, indifferent, patient moving, the fact of something that went on. Rael, she said. Yes. Why do you still come out here? To the dock, I mean. After you've been in the water, you could go straight north. You've been coming to the bankside instead. She had noticed this 3 weeks ago and had not said it. She said it now. He looked at the river. Because you're here, he said. She looked at the water. He looked at the water. The river moved. She did not answer. Not because she had nothing to say. She had many things to say, too many things. Things that stacked behind her teeth in an orderly queue waiting for the right sequence to present them in. But what she felt, in the moment he said it, was not a sentence. It was a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness she usually carried, quieter and less guarded. The stillness of something that had been braced for a long time, beginning to consider not bracing. I have a spare earphone, she said, if you want to hear the rest of the series. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not dramatically, not with announcement. It simply shifted, the way light shifts at the very beginning of morning, becoming something that had not been there before. Yes, he said, I'd like that. She pulled out her phone. She opened the podcast. She held the earphone out. He took it carefully and put it in, and she put hers in, and she pressed play. The presenter's voice came through, warm and precise, talking about Pacific navigators who read the movement of the ocean through wooden maps they had built with their own hands, who had carried the knowledge of vast distances in their bodies rather than on paper, who had crossed thousands of miles of open water because they had learned to read what the water was telling them. The river moved beneath the dock. The morning opened over the city. They sat side by side on the worn planks of the dock, in the cold and the light and the sound of the water and the voice talking about maps and distances and what it means to find your way across something enormous by paying attention to what you have rather than what you lack. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The river was saying it, in its own particular language, the language of moving forward, of carrying things without dropping them, of going on regardless, steady and patient and completely unimpressed by hesitation. The language of something that has been moving for so long that stopping is simply not in its nature, not a failure or a limit, just not what it does. The river went on. They listened, and the morning was everything it was and nothing more, and that was more than enough. She did not go home after that morning. She sat on the dock until the sun had fully risen over the mill building on the far bank, turning the river gold, and then she sat a little longer. And then she stood up and walked back through the willows and up the slope and out through the gate, and she did not go home. She turned south instead of north and walked along the river road in the full morning light, past the old gasworks and the community garden and the row of terraced houses where children were beginning to leave for school, past the small park with the dry fountain and the bakery with its glass steamed from the ovens, all the way to the far end of the road where it curved and ran along the canal. She stood at the edge of the canal and looked at the water. The canal was narrower than the river and still and green and made by people, not by time. She had walked here occasionally, but it had never been her water. It was too deliberate, too still. She preferred the river, which had no agenda, and went where it was going because that was simply what rivers did, without effort or consideration. She stood there for a while, her coffee cup still in her hand from the dock, empty now and cooling. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the phone call the night before, which she had been so afraid of for so long that the actual event of it had caught her slightly off guard, the way long-feared things sometimes did, arriving not as the catastrophe you had mapped but as something simpler and sadder and more manageable, a thing you could sit with rather than run from. She was going at Christmas. She had said this aloud to Rael on the dock, and saying it aloud had made it real in a way that thinking it for 2 weeks had not. She was going at Christmas to see her grandmother, who was 81 and not well, and who had given her a long hug 4 years ago without knowing it was the last one. She was going, and it would be difficult, and she would be glad she had gone. This was a decision she had made before she had quite made it, and she had made it sitting on a dock beside a man who did not tell her what to do, and did not ask her questions, and had simply sat there, with his long legs stretched out and his coffee in his hand, present and quiet, and not requiring anything of her at all. She turned around and walked home. At work that day she was quieter than usual, which Precious noticed, and did not push on, which was one of the qualities Naomi valued most in Precious, her ability to distinguish between the silences that wanted company and the silences that wanted room. She got room. She filled boxes and checked stems and noted conditions on manifests, and at lunchtime she went outside and stood in the thin November sun in the warehouse car park and called a train company to check prices for Christmas travel. The prices were reasonable. She booked a ticket. She stood in the car park for a moment after booking, her phone warm in her hand, the faint sounds of the warehouse behind her, and the road beyond the gate, and the ordinary December approaching city around her. She went back inside. At the end of her shift, Precious said, as Naomi was putting on her coat, "You okay?" "Yes," Naomi said. "I called my uncle back." Precious looked at her for a moment. "And?" "I booked a Christmas ticket." Precious did not say anything. She simply reached out and squeezed Naomi's arm once, briefly, and then let go, which was exactly the right gesture and no more. Naomi walked home. She bought a small bunch of tulips from the supermarket on the way, not from professional instinct, though she had instincts about flowers that were hard to set aside, but simply because she wanted something living in her apartment for the first time in a while. She put them in a glass on the kitchen windowsill and looked at them for a moment. Then she sat down and wrote an email to her grandmother. Not a long email. She was not ready for long. But something. A paragraph saying she had spoken with Owen, that she was thinking of her, that she would come at Christmas. She read it back twice. She sent it. She did not wait to see if there was a reply before going to bed. In the morning she went to the river. He was not there. She arrived at 5:45, and the bank was empty, and there was no coffee on the railing, and the dock was hers alone. She sat on it, and listened to the podcast, and watched the river, and felt the morning, the way she felt it on ordinary mornings. Cleanly, without excess weight. The ordinary weight was enough. The ordinary weight was in fact a very specific and manageable weight that she had been carrying for 3 years, and was familiar with, and had, she thought, learned to wear correctly. She thought about this. Learning to wear something correctly. The difference between carrying a weight and wearing it. The difference between being held down by a thing and being shaped by it, the way the river shaped the banks over time. Not by force but by persistence. Not by breaking anything but by moving around it until the bank adjusted. She had been worn into this shape. She was not sure she minded, entirely. She went to work, she came home, she cooked dinner, she went to bed. The days settled back into their usual rhythm. She and Rael fell back into the usual arrangement. Him north of the willows before she arrived, coffee sometimes on the railing, the occasional encounter on the bank when their timings overlapped. What was different now, after the morning they had listened to the podcast together, was something subtle in the texture of those encounters. Before, they had exchanged information at careful distances, each one exact about what they offered and what they held back. Now the precision was the same, but the holding was looser, the way a hand holds something differently once it has learned the exact weight. 3 days after the podcast morning, she arrived to find him on the bank rather than north of the willows. He was standing with his bag on his shoulder, looking at the river, which he often did. The leaving look. She had come to recognize it. He had not yet gone north. She came through the gate and he turned, and they looked at each other in the morning light. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She went through the willows to the dock. She sat down. She pressed play. After a moment she heard his footsteps going north, steady and unhurried, already familiar to her the way most things in the morning were familiar, by repetition and attention, without decision. This was how it went. Days and mornings and the river between them, and neither of them naming the accumulation. She did not name it to Precious either. Precious, to her considerable credit, did not ask directly. She asked around it with the gentle precision of someone doing excavation work, approaching the thing from different angles, testing the edges, not disturbing the center. She mentioned him occasionally and Naomi responded minimally, and Precious filed whatever she learned and held it quietly. What Precious had filed by now was this. That Naomi arrived at work on the morning she had seen Rael with a slightly different quality of attention than she arrived with on the morning she had not seen him. Not more cheerful, not lighter, but more present, more fully occupying the day as she went into it. The way you occupy things when you have recently been in the company of someone who is genuinely interested in what you think. Precious had not said this aloud, but she thought it often, and she watched. 3 weeks before Christmas, something changed. It was a Monday morning. Naomi arrived at the dock at 5:43, slightly early, the way she was sometimes slightly early when she had slept well, and the morning was clear and cold, and the walk had felt less like 11 minutes, and more like something you wanted to stay inside. She went through the willows. He was on the dock. Not on the bank. On the dock, sitting at the far end, exactly where she sat, his back to the willows, looking at the river. His bag was on the plank beside him. He had a coffee in his hand. She stopped at the end of the dock. He turned around. "I thought you might be early," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "The sky," he said. "It's doing something." She looked at the sky. He was right. There was a particular quality to the light this morning, a clarity she had not seen in weeks. The clouds that usually sat over the city in November had pulled back to the horizon, and the whole arch of the sky above the river was open and pale and precise. And in the east there was color beginning that was different from the usual cold sunrise, something warmer. She walked to the end of the dock and sat beside him. He held out the second coffee. She took it. They looked at the sky together. It was the kind of sky that you could not describe to someone who had not seen it, the kind that required presence, the kind that the cartography people she listened to would have needed new words for, because the old ones were not quite right. She sat with it and felt it, and said nothing, and neither did he. After a while the color peaked and began to settle, the sky going from that burning edge of gold to the softer, flatter light of a real November morning. And the moment passed, the way those moments always passed. Not gradually, not with announcement, but simply by no longer being quite what they had been. She breathed out. "Rael," she said. "Yes." She looked at the river. She thought about how to say what she was going to say with the right amount of precision and the right amount of honesty, which was the thing she always thought about before she said anything of consequence. She thought about what she was actually asking and what it meant to ask it. "Do you want to have dinner?" she said. "Somewhere off the river, not this." She gestured at the dock. "The other kind." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." She nodded. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. She looked at the river. He looked at the river. Below them, the water moved in the steady, continuous way it always moved, going where it was going without any particular drama about the going. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. And that was all. That was the whole of it. Two people on a dock in the early cold of a clear November morning, having decided something that was not a small decision without much ceremony about the deciding of it. Because ceremony had never been what either of them did, and because the river was there, going on, and the morning was going on, and the day was beginning, and things that were true did not require elaborate framing. She finished her coffee. She sat for the rest of her usual time on the dock, listening to her podcast, and the morning was what it was, ordinary and specific and entirely itself, like all mornings, like the river, carrying what it carried without spilling it. She went to work. She told Precious. Precious put both hands flat on her workstation and looked at the ceiling and said, with great feeling, "Finally." "It's dinner," Naomi said. "I know what dinner is," Precious said. "It doesn't have to be anything more than dinner." "Naomi," Precious said, looking at her with the full force of 2 years of patient and affectionate attention, "it is already more than dinner. It has been more than dinner for 2 months. What you have arranged is the acknowledgement of what was already more than dinner." Naomi looked at her. "Is there a problem with the acknowledgement?" she said. Precious smiled, the enormous, full, genuine smile that she had when she was genuinely and uncomplicated happy about something. "Not a single problem," she said. They went back to work. Saturday came the way Saturdays came in November, gray and cold but not unwelcoming, the kind of day the city wore well, its brick buildings going darker in the damp and its streets taking on the particular character of a place that had not been decorated for visitors and was therefore entirely itself. Naomi stood in front of her wardrobe for longer than she would admit. She owned a modest and well-selected range of clothes, none of which had been purchased for occasions like this, because she had not had occasions like this in a considerable time. She chose eventually a dark green dress she had bought months ago for a colleague's leaving party, and worn once, with a cardigan and flat boots that were comfortable and appropriate, and did not require her to think about them once she had them on. She looked at herself in the mirror briefly. She was not, she thought, the kind of person who stood in front of mirrors for long. She was the kind of person who checked for practical problems: hair, collar, a hem that had come loose, and moved on. She did this. She moved on. He had named a restaurant in the east part of the city, a place she had not been but had walked past. A small room with warm light visible through the window and a menu that changed weekly, and which she had looked up online and found interesting. He had named it with the directness she had come to associate with him, not asking what she would like, not offering a range of options, simply deciding and stating the decision, which she had found, in their first weeks of acquaintance, slightly startling, and which she now found entirely consistent. She walked there. It was a 20-minute walk. She enjoyed walks the way she enjoyed all transit on foot, as a useful interval between states, a time in which she could carry the approach to the thing without yet being at it. He was already there when she arrived. He was standing outside rather than inside, which she had not expected, but which she understood immediately when she reached him. He had been watching for her approach so that they could go in together, rather than one of them waiting inside with the strange, awkward staging of one person having been seated and the other arriving. He had thought about this. He had acted on the thought. She registered this without saying anything about it. "You found it," he said. "I've walked past it," she said. They went in. The room was small and warm, and the tables were close enough to each other to feel like company, but not so close as to feel crowded. They were seated near the window. The menu was on a small card, handwritten, 7 options, all of them interesting. She ordered without needing to look twice at it. He ordered with the same ease. The waiter brought bread and oil. They ate the bread. The waiter brought wine. She had a glass of red. He had water, which she noted without comment, and which he offered no explanation for, which she respected. "How's the contract situation?" she said, when the waiter had gone. "Moving," he said. "Diane has the documentation almost complete. We should have a clear position before the new year." "That's good." "Yes." He looked at her. "The clarity will be a relief. Not because the outcome is uncertain, it's not, but because the having of the thing is different from the resolving of it. When it's resolved, it can be behind me. At the moment, it is beside me." She understood this exactly. "My Christmas trip is booked," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She thought. "Mostly ready," she said. "There are parts of it I'm not ready for, and other parts I'm more ready for than I expected." "Which parts are you not ready for?" "The parts that involve the people who are not my grandmother and my uncle," she said. "The wider family, the ones who will want explanations for the 4 years and for the leaving, and for things that happened before the leaving that I am not going to explain." He nodded. "You don't have to explain them. I know, but the not explaining requires energy. The holding of the position in a room full of people who want you to give up the position. You'll hold it," he said. She looked at him. He said it with the simple certainty of someone making an assessment rather than offering encouragement, which was a different quality entirely, and a more useful one. "I will," she said. They ate. The food was good, straightforward and careful, the kind of cooking that did not try to be anything other than what it was, which she found she appreciated the same way she appreciated competence in any form. She told him about a delivery she had received that week from a farm in Portugal that had packed the flowers with such care that she had stood at the receiving dock for a moment just looking at them, the way you stand for a moment at something done exactly right. He told her about a project he had been working on with a logistics company, a process problem with how information moved between their warehouse teams and their driving teams, which created a 12-hour delay in a chain that could have been running in 2 hours. He had found the blockage in the 3rd week of the engagement, a single handover point where 2 systems that were both technically functional were not, in practice, communicating. 2 fully working systems that didn't talk to each other, she said. "Yes." "What did you do?" "Built a bridge," he said. "A 3rd system, very simple, that translated between the 2. The complicated solution would have been to replace one of the systems. The simple solution was to acknowledge that both systems worked, and work out what they needed to connect them." She thought about this. She thought about it in the way she thought about most things Rael said, with the specific attention she gave to ideas that were ostensibly about one thing, and were also, at another level, about something else. "You prefer the simple solution," she said. "I prefer the effective solution," he said, "which is sometimes complicated, but in my experience, systems that have been running a long time have usually been running for a reason. You don't pull them out without understanding why they exist." She looked at him. "My warehouse systems," she said. "Is that what you're talking about?" He held her gaze. I was talking about logistics software, he said. Rael. A pause. You're very good at what you do, he said. The assessing, the receiving, the knowing immediately what condition something is in when it arrives. You didn't develop that by accident. No, she said. And you applied the same systems to your personal life, he said. Very good ones. Built for specific conditions. Also for specific conditions, she said. Yes, he said. But conditions change. She looked at the breadbasket. She tore a small piece from the last roll and did not eat it. I know they change, she said. I know you know, he said. They looked at each other across the table in the warm light of the small restaurant. Two people who had been telling each other true things in small increments for 2 months, who had sat together in the cold above a moving river more mornings than either of them had counted, who had built, without intending to build anything, something that was more significant than either of them had yet said aloud. I'm going to tell you something, she said. All right, he said. She put the bread down. She looked at her wine glass. She thought about how to say it with the correct amount of precision. When I was 22, she said, I was in a situation that I had to leave. It was not dramatic. It was not anything that would make sense in a single sentence. It was simply a configuration of people and expectations and history that I could not continue to be inside without becoming someone I did not want to be. She paused. So I left. I drove away. I moved here. I built this. She gestured, slightly, at nothing specific and everything specific, and I built it carefully, because the leaving had costs I had not fully anticipated, and I was not going to spend those costs on something that fell apart. He was listening. Not waiting, listening. The systems I built, she said, are very good. I am quite proud of them, but they were built to maintain a specific set of conditions, and some of the conditions have changed, and I am, she paused, choosing the word exactly. I am in the process of updating the systems, which is slower than building from scratch, but more honest. He was quiet for a moment. What is updating? He said. Calling my uncle, she said, going at Christmas, sitting on a dock and telling someone I don't know very well about things I have not told people I know very well. He held her gaze. And dinner, he said. And dinner, she agreed. The waiter came and cleared their plates and asked about dessert. They both declined, in the same moment, without consulting each other, and she thought this was the kind of small synchrony that you did not engineer, that simply arrived when two people had been in each other's company long enough to inhabit the same rhythms without trying. He walked her home. Not all the way, she had not asked him to, and she had the sense he would not have assumed the full walk, but through the market area and along the canal road, which was a reasonable portion of the route, and at the junction where her road diverged from the canal he stopped. Thank you for dinner, she said. Thank you for suggesting it, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the lamplight of the street corner, in the cold of a November Saturday night, with the city going about its ordinary weekend life around them, she had the clear and uncomplicated thought that she was looking at a person she was very glad she had screamed at 3 months earlier. The river on Monday, she said. Yes, he said. Good night, Rael. Good night, Naomi. She walked home. She went upstairs. She sat on her sofa and looked at the tulips she had bought, which were almost gone now, their petals falling, the stems gone soft at the bases, finishing. She needed to replace them. She went to bed. She slept well. Christmas came. She took the train on the 23rd of December, a 3-hour journey north through a landscape that went from urban to suburban to green and gray and wide, and she watched it through the window with her earphones in and her cartography podcast playing, and her hands around a coffee from the buffet car, and she thought about maps and distances and what it meant to navigate something vast by reading the qualities of the water you were in. She arrived at the station, and Owen was there to meet her, and when she saw him, she felt something move in her chest that was not grief and was not joy, but was something between them, the way the light at the horizon is between the colors on either side. He was older than she remembered, or she remembered him as she had last seen him, which was also 4 years older than the version she had first known, and seeing him now required an update she had not prepared for, the update of time on a person you have held still in your memory, the way you hold things still when you stop looking at them. Naomi, he said. Uncle Owen, she said. They did not hug immediately. They looked at each other for a moment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, and then they did. She stayed for 4 days. She saw her grandmother on the first afternoon, a small woman in a large chair by a window that looked onto the garden that was finished for the winter, the raised beds brown and resting, the greenhouse standing empty behind the house. Her grandmother turned when Naomi came into the room, and her face did the thing that faces do when they receive something they have been waiting for. It did not break into expression, It simply changed quality, went from patient to present, the way the sky changes when the sun comes fully out. "My girl," her grandmother said. Naomi sat beside the chair and took her grandmother's hand and held it, and she did not say very much, and her grandmother did not say very much, and it was the most complete conversation she had in 4 days. The wider family was exactly as she had expected, the questions, the opinions, the careful and sometimes not careful curiosity about where she had been and what she had been doing and whether she was all right. She held her position. It cost what she had known it would cost, which was more than she would have liked and less than she had feared. She was civil, she was clear. She was, when she needed to be, quiet, in a way that closed the question without unkindness. On the third evening she sat in the kitchen with Owen while her grandmother slept and the rest of the family were in the other room watching television, and Owen made tea and she drank it and they talked about things that were not difficult for a while, and then Owen said, "You seem different." She looked at her tea. "In what way?" she said. "Less," he thought about it. "Less braced," he said. "You always came into rooms braced, even when you were young, like you were already ready for the thing that was about to be hard. You seem a bit less like that." She thought about this. "Someone said something to me recently," she said, "about conditions changing." "What kind of conditions?" "The kind you build systems for," she said. "And then you keep using the systems after the conditions they were built for have shifted." Owen looked at her. "Who said that?" "Someone I have coffee with in the mornings," she said. He nodded, in the way of a person who is hearing something significant being understated and is choosing to respect the understatement. "Is it someone good?" he said. She thought about Rael, about the river and the cold water and the composure that was not coldness and the listening that was not waiting, about the worn patch on the dock where two presences had overlapped, unknowing, for 6 weeks before the overlap became visible, about a man who said, "That sounds exhausting," with the quiet certainty of someone who meant it, and left coffee without a note, because notes are impersonal and coffee is real. "Yes," she said. "He's very good." Owen smiled. He did not ask anything further. He refilled her cup and they talked about other things, and outside the kitchen window the garden rested in the winter dark, waiting for spring, patient as anything. She came back on the 27th. The train south was quiet, the between-Christmas lull of public transport, the carriages half empty and peaceful, a man asleep across 2 seats in the far corner, and a child drawing in a small notebook near the doors. She sat by the window again and watched the green and gray landscape reverse itself, becoming gradually more urban, the hills giving way to edge of city development, and then the city itself, familiar and waiting. She texted Rael from the train, back on the 27th. She sent a full stop after 27th. He replied within 10 minutes. "How was it?" She thought about how to answer this accurately. She typed, "Hard and good, both at once." She sent it. He replied, "Yes, that sounds right." She looked at the reply for a while. She put the phone away. She looked out the window at the city arriving around the train, at the rooftops and the water towers and the distant tower blocks and the nearer streets where people were walking in the post-Christmas gray, going about their lives, ordinary and specific, and each one carrying something she could not see from the train window. She arrived at the station. She took the bus across the city. She got off at her stop and walked the familiar 11-minute route home, past the gasworks and the community garden and up the stairs of her building. And she unlocked her door and put her bag down and stood in the center of her studio apartment and looked at it. It smelled of her. It smelled of the specific quality of a closed-up space that belonged to one person, her books, her coffee, the particular neutral warmth of her radiator. It was exactly as she had left it. And for the first time, standing in the middle of it, she felt the full weight of how carefully and deliberately she had kept it exactly as she had left it, always, every morning, every evening, everything in its place, nothing out by more than necessary. She had been keeping this place the way you keep something you're afraid to disturb. She stood in it for a moment, then she put the kettle on and unpacked her bag and put a load of washing in, and opened the window for fresh air and made tea and sat on the sofa and called Rael. He answered on the second ring. "You're back." "I'm back," she said. "How was Christmas?" "Quiet," he said. "Good. I spoke to my mother." "How is she?" "Relieved," he said. "She worries about me when she cannot reach me directly." "Is the company thing any closer to resolved?" "Diane called on Christmas Eve," he said. "The documentation is complete. We have a position meeting in January. She thinks it will be concluded by February." "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause, not the kind that needed filling. "The morning after next," she said. 5:45, he said. 5:45, she agreed. She went to bed. She slept, for the first time in years, in the particular deep way that suggests the body has been waiting for something to be over, and is relieved that it is done, not solved, not finished, but past the hardest part of it, on the other side, moving forward. The morning after next was clear and cold, the last days of December. The city between years and existing somehow outside time in the way it always did in that window, emptier and quieter, and somehow more itself. She walked to the river at 5:44. He was there on the bank when she came through the gate, not on the dock, standing exactly as he sometimes stood before he went north, looking at the river, his bag on his shoulder, his breath making small clouds in the morning cold. He turned when he heard her on the path. They looked at each other across the bank. The river moved behind him, gray and present and unhurried. She walked to where he was standing. He did not move to meet her. He let her come the full distance, which was the right thing, which was consistent, which was him. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She stood beside him, both of them looking at the river. "How's your grandmother?" he said. "Smaller than I remembered," she said, and completely herself. "That sounds like a person worth knowing." "She is," Naomi said. "She always was." The river moved. The light was just beginning. The eastern sky going from black to a deep and particular gray. The first bird sounds starting in the willows. She thought about the 4 days she had just come back from, and the people she had seen, and the conversations she had held and the ones she had declined to have, and the evening in the kitchen with Owen, and what he had said about her being less braced, and what she had said about conditions changing, and what it meant to say yes, he is very good to a question asked by someone who knew you well. She thought about the worn patch in the dock planks and the 6 weeks before she knew, and the river that had been holding both of them separately for so long before it brought them together. "Rail," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He looked at her. She had prepared something to say. She had prepared it on the train and refined it in the kitchen making tea, and had gone over it lying in bed before sleep. It was a good thing, accurate and measured, saying what needed to be said without excess and without shortage. She said none of it. Instead she said, "I don't want to be careful with you." He was very still for a moment. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "which is different from careful. Careful means managing what you receive so it doesn't cost anything. Honest means," she stopped, looked at the river. "I think I have been careful for a very long time, and I am ready to be honest instead." He looked at her for a moment that held several things in it simultaneously. Then he said, "I have been careful too. For different reasons, in different ways." "I know," she said. "And I'm tired of it," he said. "Yes," she said. The river went on. The light was coming. The morning was arriving in the way mornings arrived on this bank, not with drama, not with announcement, simply by becoming more itself. The dark giving way to the gray, and the gray giving way to the pale and tentative first color. The whole thing so gradual, you could not point to the moment it changed, only to the fact that it had. He reached out and took her hand. She looked at their hands, then at him. Then she looked at the river, and the river looked back, which is what rivers do. They reflect, and they move, and they go on, and they take no particular position on the things that happen on their banks except to continue, steadily and without judgment, carrying everything, and losing nothing. She stood on the bank beside the man who had been in her water before she knew him, in the early morning of the last days of the year, with the cold and everything, and the light coming and the river going south, always south, and she felt the specific and profound and entirely ordinary thing of being in the right place at the right time with the right person, which was not a dramatic thing or a grand thing but was, she thought, perhaps the most substantial thing there was. She held his hand. The dock was there behind them, the worn patch in the planks, 3 years of her mornings, shaped into wood, and beside it, now, the ghost of 6 weeks of his mornings, present in the water, in the moving invisible record of all the things the river had held while they were each on its banks separately, before the morning it brought them together. The river went on. They stayed a little longer than they needed to, and then they went to their separate days, and the morning was what it was, and the river was what it was, and the city was what it was, ordinary and specific and full of people who were learning things they had not expected to learn, in places they had not expected to be, from rivers that would not tell them anything directly but that went on moving regardless, patient and certain and going somewhere. She walked home. She bought oats at the corner shop. She went upstairs and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backs of the buildings on the other street, at the yellow light in the second-floor window that came on every morning at this hour. Someone beginning their day in the specific and private way people begin days when they believe no one is watching. She drank her coffee. The morning opened around her, ordinary and full. And somewhere on the other side of the city, a man sat at his kitchen counter with his own coffee and his phone and the day's first emails loading on his screen, and he sat with them for a moment before he began, in the particular way he had learned in 40-something mornings in a cold river, just being somewhere, fully, before the day began. Just being somewhere. In the river, on the bank, at the kitchen counter, on a dock above moving water, listening to the same thing as someone sitting beside you, the earphone between you carrying something about people who had mapped the ocean by learning to read what the water was telling them, who had crossed enormous distances not by fighting the current but by understanding it, by paying enough attention to what was moving beneath the surface to know where it was going. The water knew. It always did. You simply had to be quiet enough to listen.